Professor Martin Henshaw was a name that sent chills down the spines of students at New York University's Stern School of Business. A veteran economist and self-proclaimed intellectual powerhouse, Henshaw had spent the last 3 decades demolishing students in debates, his sharp tongue and unshakable arrogance earning him a reputation as an unbeatable force in academia. His belief? No student could match his intellect, let alone a so-called privileged kid who rode on his family's name. So, when Barron Trump walked into his advanced economic theories class, the professor's eyes gleamed with anticipation. The son of the sitting U.S. president, Barron was already the subject of whispered conversations in the hallways. Could he actually be smart, or was he just another rich kid trying to play businessman? Henshaw wasted no time in setting the stage. "Mr. Trump," he said, smirking as he adjusted his glasses, "given your family's affinity for business, I assume you know something about economic principles? Or do you plan to run on slogans and Twitter soundbites?" The classroom erupted in muffled laughter. Barron, now 19 and standing at an impressive 6 feet 7 inches, remained unfazed. He knew how people saw him, just a privileged boy living in the shadow of his father. But he had spent years preparing for this. Unlike the public perception, Barron had developed a keen interest in economics, studying under some of the world's best mentors. He met Henshaw's gaze calmly. "I'd be happy to discuss any economic principle you'd like, Professor." Henshaw's smirk widened. "Let's make this interesting then. A challenge. If you can out-debate me on a major economic issue of my choosing, I'll publicly acknowledge your intelligence. If you fail, you drop my class and admit that real economics isn't inherited, it's earned." The room went silent. No student had ever dared to challenge Henshaw, let alone agree to a debate. Barron nodded. Challenge accepted. The class erupted into whispers. Henshaw had never lost before, but for the first time in years, there was something in his opponent's eyes that unsettled him. A quiet confidence. Little did anyone know, the ending of this debate would leave everyone speechless. The following week, the atmosphere in the lecture hall was electric. Word had spread across campus like wildfire. Barron Trump had accepted Professor Henshaw's challenge. Students who had never set foot in an economics class now fought for seats, eager to witness the showdown between the arrogant professor and the son of the U.S. president. Henshaw, dressed in his signature tweed blazer, stood at the podium with an air of supreme confidence. He had spent the last few days carefully selecting a topic that would ensure Barron's failure. "The topic of our debate," he announced, pausing for dramatic effect, "is modern monetary theory and its implications for the U.S. economy." A murmur ran through the crowd. MMT was a complex and controversial topic, one that even experienced economists struggled to explain. It was clear that Henshaw had set a trap. Barron, seated at the opposite end of the hall, merely nodded. "Let's begin." Henshaw launched into his argument first, his voice laced with condescension. He passionately explained how modern monetary theory proposed that governments with sovereign currencies, like the U.S., could print money without limits as long as inflation was controlled. He dismissed it as reckless, arguing that it led to hyperinflation and economic instability. MMT is a fantasy created by those who do not understand real-world economics, he declared, fixing his gaze on Barron. The very notion that a government can endlessly print money without consequences is absurd. The class nodded in agreement. Henshaw had delivered his argument flawlessly. Now all eyes were on Barron. The young Trump adjusted the microphone in front of him. "With all due respect, Professor, your argument is based on outdated assumptions. You claim MMT is a fantasy, yet nations like Japan and the U.S. have been operating under similar principles for decades. If printing money alone caused hyperinflation, we would have seen it already." A few students leaned forward, intrigued. Barron continued. "Traditional economic models assume that government debt is inherently bad. But what if I told you that a country with control over its currency can never run out of money the way a household does? The real question isn't whether the government can print money, it's how that money is utilized. If spent productively on infrastructure, education, and innovation, it generates long-term economic growth." Professor Henshaw's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Barron wasn't reciting talking points, he was making a well-reasoned argument. "So, Professor," Barron said, locking eyes with him, "is it truly reckless to use sovereign monetary power for economic expansion, or is it reckless to cling to outdated theories in a world that's evolving?" The room fell silent. For the first time in his career, Henshaw had no immediate rebuttal. The debate was far from over, but it was clear Barron Trump was not going down easily. A tense silence gripped the lecture hall. Never before had Professor Henshaw faced a student who could counter his arguments with such poise and precision. He cleared his throat, masking his surprise with an amused chuckle. "Well, Mr. Trump, I'll give you credit for doing your homework," Henshaw said, straightening his posture. "But you're ignoring the fundamental issue. Government spending is only sustainable if the economy can absorb it. What happens when too much money chases too few goods? Inflation skyrockets. Are you seriously suggesting that unlimited spending has no consequences?" Barron didn't flinch. "I never said spending has no consequences. I said the consequences depend on how money is utilized. Inflation isn't just about the money supply, it's about supply chains, productivity, and demand. Japan, for instance, has one of the highest debt-to-GDP ratios in the world, yet struggles with deflation. Why? Because debt alone doesn't determine economic stability. Output and innovation do." The room stirred. This wasn't the canned rhetoric of a politician's son. Barron was making sophisticated, data-backed points. Henshaw's smirk returned. "All right, let's test your knowledge. If you believe government debt is not a pressing issue, tell me, how do you explain the collapse of economies that engaged in excessive spending? Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, they printed money too. Yet their economies crumbled under hyperinflation." Barron leaned forward, his voice steady. "The key difference, Professor, is that those nations lacked two things: productive output and global trust in their currency. The US dollar, on the other hand, is the world's reserve currency. Investors don't flee the dollar in times of crisis. They run to it. That's why the US can sustain higher deficits than other nations without immediate consequences." The room was now completely captivated. Even students who barely understood economics could sense that Barron was holding his own against one of NYU's toughest professors. Henshaw's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a clever answer, but tell me, Mr. Trump, if the government can just print money endlessly, why do we even need taxes?" A few students snickered, thinking Henshaw had backed Barron into a corner. But Barron merely smiled. "Taxes serve multiple purposes," he replied smoothly. "First, they regulate inflation by pulling excess money out of circulation. Second, they drive demand for the currency. People need US dollars to pay taxes, ensuring its continued value. Third, they redistribute wealth and fund public goods. The misconception is that taxes fund federal spending. In reality, the government creates money first and taxes later." Henshaw folded his arms. For the first time, his face betrayed a hint of frustration. He had walked into this debate assuming he'd dismantle Barron in minutes. Instead, the young Trump was not only keeping up, he was making points that left the class rethinking fundamental economic principles. One student raised a hand. "Professor, isn't he kind of right?" Laughter rippled through the room. Henshaw forced a smile but didn't respond. Barron took a deep breath, then delivered his final statement of the round. "Economics isn't about ideology, it's about adaptation. Clinging to outdated theories out of pride only hurts future generations. The question isn't whether modern monetary theory is perfect. The question is whether traditional economics is flexible enough to handle modern challenges." A hushed awe settled over the room. Even students who had walked in expecting a Trump defeat were beginning to reconsider. Henshaw's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to let a student, especially a Trump, humiliate him in his own classroom. He had one last trick up his sleeve. The real shock was yet to come. Professor Henshaw's reputation was on the line, and he knew it. His usual strategy, intimidation through intellect, had failed against Barron Trump. The young man wasn't just repeating facts. He understood them, challenged them, and worst of all, was earning the respect of the students. Henshaw took a slow, deliberate breath before delivering his final move. "Fine, Mr. Trump," he said, stepping away from the podium. "You've impressed the class with your theoretical knowledge. But real-world economics isn't a debate. It's about results. So here's my challenge. If you truly believe in the principles you're defending, I want you to prove it." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Prove it how?" "I'm giving you a hypothetical budget of $10 billion, Henshaw said, turning to the massive screen behind him. Using your so-called modern economic approach, I want you to devise a strategy to stimulate an economy suffering from stagnation, rising unemployment, and a struggling private sector. You have 5 minutes. Gasps rippled through the classroom. This was unheard of. Henshaw was putting Barron on the spot in a way no student had ever been tested before. Barron, however, didn't flinch. He simply nodded, cracked his knuckles, and walked toward the screen. Henshaw leaned back, satisfied. This is where he cracks, the professor thought. Barron tapped a few buttons on the digital display, pulling up a blank spreadsheet. Then, without hesitation, he began. Step 1. Targeted public investment. Barron outlined how he would allocate $4 billion toward infrastructure projects, specifically in renewable energy and smart manufacturing. These industries aren't just about sustainability. They create high-paying jobs and drive innovation, he explained. This ensures long-term economic output instead of temporary fixes. Step 2. Direct economic stimulus. He allocated $3 billion toward direct cash transfers for middle and low-income families, explaining that putting money into the hands of consumers boosts demand, which in turn fuels private sector growth. Step 3. Small business expansion incentives. Another $2 billion was designated for small business grants and zero-interest loans. Unlike traditional tax cuts, this ensures that money actually gets spent rather than hoarded, Barron pointed out. It directly stimulates entrepreneurship. Step 4. Workforce training and education. The final $1 billion was allocated to workforce development, particularly in AI, automation, and green technology sectors. This isn't just about creating jobs. It's about future-proofing the economy. Barron turned to the professor. This plan increases GDP, lowers unemployment, and keeps inflation in check by investing in productivity. It's not reckless spending. It's strategic economic planning. Silence. The classroom was in shock. Even those who didn't fully understand economics could see that Barron had just formulated a viable economic plan in 5 minutes. Henshaw's face turned pale. His smug expression had disappeared entirely. One student broke the silence. Professor, do you have a rebuttal? Henshaw opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had been outmaneuvered, not just in debate but in practicality. Then, something truly shocking happened. The proud, arrogant Professor Henshaw, who had never conceded a debate in his entire career, slowly nodded. He hesitated, then sighed. I underestimated you, Mr. Trump. A wave of murmurs and gasps filled the air. For the first time in NYU Stern's history, Professor Martin Henshaw had admitted defeat. But the biggest shock was still yet to come. The stunned silence in the lecture hall stretched on. Students looked at each other, unsure of how to react. Professor Henshaw, the man who had built his career on intellectual dominance, had just admitted that Barron Trump had bested him. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. Henshaw let out a slow breath. Then, to everyone's disbelief, he applauded. The entire room froze. Then, like a ripple turning into a wave, the students joined in. The sound of applause filled the hall, growing louder and louder. Some students even stood up, cheering. Barron Trump had done what no one before him could. He had humbled the most arrogant professor at NYU. Henshaw, still clapping, took a step toward Barron and extended his hand. You've proven me wrong, he admitted. You're not just some privileged kid. You understand economics, and more importantly, you understand how to adapt it to real-world problems. That's a skill most politicians and even some economists lack. Barron shook his hand, his expression calm but respectful. I appreciate that, Professor. As the applause finally began to settle, a student from the back called out, So what now? Does Barron get extra credit or something? Laughter filled the hall, but Henshaw smirked. No, he said, but I will be making a change. From now on, I'm incorporating modern economic theories, including the ones Barron discussed, into my curriculum. Because whether I like it or not, the world is changing. And my job isn't to cling to the past. It's to prepare my students for the future. Another round of applause erupted. As Barron gathered his things to leave, he noticed something. Many of the students who had previously dismissed him as just a rich kid were now looking at him differently, with respect. And as he walked out of the lecture hall, one thing was certain. Barron Trump had just rewritten the legacy of his name, not as a politician's son, but as a formidable thinker in his own right. And even Professor Henshaw had to admit, he never saw that coming.